April 17, 1942. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The morning mist clung low over the fields as a tractor rumbled across the dark soil, the sound of its engine carrying faintly over the rolling hills. The man at the wheel, Earl Whitmore, a 47-year-old beekeeper and part-time farmer, cut the motor and wiped his brow. His hands were cracked and sticky with traces of honey. Around him, hundreds of wooden hives dotted the landscape like tiny barracks, humming with life. The world was at war, but out here, the war still felt far away. Earl had already sent his eldest son, Private James Whitmore, off to basic training 6 months earlier. He received short letters now and then, stories of cold tents, bad coffee, and endless drills. But what caught Earl's attention most wasn't in the words, but in what was missing: energy, morale, health. James had written that many soldiers were getting sick, nothing serious, just weak stomachs and low energy. Their rations were dry, processed, and often tasteless. Most men tossed the canned beans aside if they could find something better. That letter stuck with Earl. As he pried open one of his hives, he muttered, "You boys fight with rifles, and I'll fight with bees." He didn't know it yet, but that offhand remark, spoken in a foggy field surrounded by humming insects, would spark one of the most unexpected contributions to the Allied war effort. That afternoon, Earl loaded a few jars of honey into his truck and drove to the local army supply depot. It was a plain brick building filled with officers, clerks, and the smell of tobacco. Earl approached the quartermaster's desk with a polite nod. "Sir," he began, "I think I can help your boys keep their strength up." The young lieutenant behind the desk raised an eyebrow. "With honey?" Earl nodded earnestly. "It's natural sugar, sir. Keeps longer than you'd think. Gives clean energy, no crash. Could mix it into bread, or—" The lieutenant cut him off with a chuckle. "Mr. Whitmore, we're fighting the biggest war in history, not running a bakery." Laughter rippled through the office. "Ain't got time for grandma's remedies," someone muttered. Earl's face flushed, but he held his ground. "You'd be surprised what a spoonful of honey can do for a man who's gone 3 days on coffee and cold beans." The lieutenant sighed. "Look, I appreciate your patriotism. But we've got scientists and nutritionists working on rations. You leave feeding the army to them." He signed the rejection slip and slid it across the desk. Earl left the depot with his honey still sealed tight in the crate beside him. As he drove home, the sky began to darken with rain clouds. The windshield blurred, and so did his thoughts, but beneath the sting of humiliation, a stubborn idea began to form. Maybe they were right, maybe it was a stupid idea. But what if it wasn't? That night, as thunder rolled across the Pennsylvania hills, Earl sat at his kitchen table under the dim light of a kerosene lamp. He turned the honey jar in his hands, watching the golden liquid catch the light. Then he reached for an old army ration label he'd gotten from his son's last letter. "Hardtack, dried beef, tinned peaches," he read aloud. "No wonder the boys are tired." He flipped the ration card over and began sketching an idea: a small tin, no bigger than a snuff box, filled with a dense mixture of honey, oats, and ground nuts. A soldier could carry it in his pocket. No mess. No spoilage. He wrote across the top of the page in rough pencil: "Honey Energy Block." The next morning, he started experimenting. He boiled honey in an iron pot, stirred in crushed oats, roasted peanuts, and a pinch of salt. The result was crude, sticky, uneven, but it held together. He left it on the counter overnight. By morning, it had hardened into a golden brick that smelled faintly of roasted nuts and sweetness. He broke off a piece, chewed it thoughtfully, and smiled. "Stupid idea, huh?" he muttered. Over the next few weeks, Earl refined the recipe, adding powdered milk for protein, wax paper for wrapping, and a bit of molasses for texture. He called it Earl's Block. But this wasn't just about one man's curiosity anymore. Across America, the war effort was consuming everything: steel, rubber, fuel, sugar. Civilians were urged to find substitutes, to innovate, to keep production alive. Earl's neighbors laughed at his obsession with honey, but one of them, Clara Hensley, a nutritionist working with the local Red Cross, didn't. When she stopped by his farm to collect honey for first aid kits, she noticed the neat rows of small golden bars cooling on the windowsill. "What on earth are these?" she asked. Earl grinned. "Future soldier fuel." She took a bite, raised an eyebrow, and chewed thoughtfully. "That's actually pretty good." Clara asked if she could take a few samples back to the Red Cross testing office in Harrisburg. "Be my guest," Earl said. "If it helps one of those boys out there, it's worth the effort." He didn't realize then that her small gesture would set off a chain of events reaching all the way to the War Department in Washington, D.C. What started as a stupid trick with honey on a lonely Pennsylvania farm was about to become a vital part of the American soldier's survival kit. June 1942, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The Red Cross Food Testing Division was a modest facility tucked between warehouses that smelled of chemicals and flour. Inside, nutritionist Clara Hensley stood beside a steel countertop, unwrapping one of Earl's sticky golden bars. A few army dietitians leaned over curiously. "So this is the Beekeeper's miracle snack," one of them said with a smirk. Clara ignored the sarcasm. She broke the bar cleanly in half. It snapped like toffee, revealing a dense, chewy interior. "He calls it a honey energy block," she said. "No preservatives. No synthetic sugars. All natural." The senior dietitian, Captain Robert Langley, lifted a brow. "Honey doesn't spoil easily. High osmotic pressure, antibacterial properties, theoretically, this could last months." Clara nodded. "That's the point. He believes it could sustain troops on long marches." Langley took a cautious bite. The sweetness hit first, mellow and nutty, with a hint of smoke from roasted oats. He chewed slowly, thinking. "Surprisingly pleasant," he said. "Better than half the ration biscuits we've got." He turned to Clara. "Get me the recipe." 3 weeks later, a sealed envelope stamped U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, Experimental Ration Program, arrived at Earl Whitmore's farmhouse. Earl slid it open with a shaking hand. "Mr. Whitmore, your honey-based energy ration has been approved for field testing under controlled conditions. Please deliver 200 units to the Harrisburg Depot by July 10 for shipment to Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland." Earl stared at the letter for a long moment, barely breathing. Then he let out a laugh so loud the bees stirred in their hives outside. He had done it. For the next 2 weeks, the farmhouse turned into a miniature factory. Earl, his wife Martha, and a few neighborhood kids mixed vats of honey, oats, and powdered milk by hand, pressing the mixture into wooden molds and wrapping the cooled bars in wax paper printed with small, hand-stamped eagles. Each bar bore the same label: Whitmore Honey Block, Energy for the Front. When the truck finally pulled away for Harrisburg, loaded with 200 boxes smelling faintly of sweet smoke, Earl stood by the dirt road in silence, watching the dust trail fade into the horizon. "Go on," he murmured. "Do your job." Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, July 1942. Under the scorching sun, soldiers from the 29th Infantry Division gathered around a mess table stacked with unusual-looking ration tins. A quartermaster officer opened one and raised an eyebrow. "What's this? Candy?" "Not exactly," said Captain Langley, now transferred to the ration evaluation team. "It's a new field food from a Pennsylvania beekeeper. Supposed to provide sustained energy. We're testing its durability and nutritional value." The soldiers snickered. "So we're eating Beekeeper bars now? Great." Langley shrugged. "Orders are orders. You'll eat them on the march and report the results." For 3 days, the men carried only water and the honey blocks as their primary ration during simulated maneuvers. By the second day, the grumbling had faded. The bars melted slowly in the mouth, releasing sugar in steady bursts rather than all at once. There was no crash, no stomach upset. Private Thomas Keegan later wrote in his evaluation log. Didn't think much of it at first. Sweet as sin, but it kept me going. No shakes, no hunger, even after 10 miles. I'd take this over those damn hardtacks any day. The field reports went up the chain, and soon a small note reached Washington. Whitmore honey block demonstrated positive results for energy retention and troop satisfaction. Recommend limited production trial for overseas deployment. By October 1942, the first 10,000 Whitmore honey blocks were included in special rations sent with the 82nd Airborne Division during their early operations in North Africa. Packed in wax-sealed tins to withstand desert heat, the golden bars arrived at forward bases near Oran and Algiers. The reaction from the field was immediate and enthusiastic. Corporal Eddie Salazar, riding home from Algeria, told his family, "You wouldn't believe it, they're giving us candy made from honey. Some farmer's recipe, they say. You eat one before a patrol, and you don't feel hungry for hours. The medics say it's keeping us steady, especially in this heat. We call it liquid gold in a brick." Word spread fast. Soldiers began trading other rations for Whitmore's blocks. They even melted them in their canteen cups to sweeten tea or coffee. What had started as a rural experiment was now fueling men halfway across the world. But success also brought attention, and not all of it welcome. Back in Washington, the Office of Food Resources raised concerns. The war effort already faced sugar shortages, and honey was now being diverted to make energy bars. One official scoffed, "We're not feeding bees when we could be fueling bombers." A memo landed on Captain Langley's desk ordering a review of the product's supply sustainability. Langley, unwilling to see it scrapped, arranged a visit to the source himself, Earl's farm in Lancaster. November 9, 1942, Lancaster County. The Army Jeep pulled up beside the barn as Earl and his wife were loading wooden frames of honeycomb into the extractor. Langley stepped out, dusting off his uniform. "You must be Mr. Whitmore," he said. Earl nodded, his palms sticky with amber. "That's right. You here to tell me it worked, or it didn't?" Langley smiled faintly. "Both." They sat at the kitchen table, the smell of beeswax and coffee in the air. Langley explained the situation, the demand, the praise, and the looming supply issue. Earl listened quietly, then leaned back. "You're saying we need more honey, but there's not enough to go around." "Exactly," Langley said. "If this thing's going to keep going, we need industrial production, not backyard beekeeping." Earl thought for a moment. Then his eyes brightened. "What if I showed you a way to make more honey, faster, without straining the bees?" Langley blinked. "Is that even possible?" Earl grinned, reaching for a notepad. "It's a stupid trick I learned back when I couldn't afford enough hives. But it might just save your boys a lot of sugar." And with that, the farmer who'd once been laughed out of an army depot was about to show the U.S. military how a simple twist of ingenuity, and a bit of honey, could change the course of wartime nutrition. November 1942, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Earl Whitmore pulled a worn ledger from his shelf and opened it to a page filled with sketches, diagrams of beehives, flowers, feeding systems, and strange arrows looping between them. He laid it on the table in front of Captain Langley, who leaned in, squinting at the crude drawings. "This," Earl said, tapping the page, "is what you might call my stupid trick." Langley frowned. "What am I looking at?" Earl chuckled. "Artificial feeding. Supplemental nectar made from corn syrup, sugar water, and pollen substitutes. Most beekeepers use it only in winter to keep colonies alive. But if you do it right, and at the right temperature, bees don't just survive, they double production. The trick's in the mix ratio and feeding schedule." He flipped to another page. When flowers are scarce, most hives slow down. Mine don't. I keep them fooled, they think it's spring all year long. Langley blinked. You're telling me you can trick bees into overproducing honey? Earl grinned. Not tricking, motivating. Same way your boys march better with a decent meal. Langley sat back in his chair, a faint smile forming. Mr. Whitmore, you realize what this means? Earl shrugged. Means I can feed a lot more soldiers. A week later, Langley submitted a report titled Experimental Civilian Honey Production for Military Nutritional Supply. It was short, handwritten, and stamped classified, internal use only. The conclusion read: Recommend immediate allocation of materials to Lancaster County for expanded honey yield using Whitmore feeding protocol. Objective: supplement ration sugar deficit with renewable agricultural source. To the bureaucrats in Washington, it was just another wartime logistics note. To the Quartermaster Corps, it was a lifeline. Within a month, trucks began arriving in Lancaster with barrels of corn syrup, sacks of soy flour, and fuel for the hives. The sleepy county, known mostly for dairy and corn, turned into the nerve center of America's honey-based energy program. Locals dubbed it the Sweet Front. Farmers across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois were recruited to copy Earl's system. The government even distributed small booklets titled Beekeeping for Victory, with simplified instructions adapted from Earl's handwritten notes. What began as one man's idea now powered an entire agricultural initiative, one that would soon make headlines in every war nutrition bulletin. January 1943, Army Research Lab, Chicago. In a sterile lab lined with glass jars and calorimeters, technicians in white coats tested the chemical stability of the new honey energy bars. The scientists found something remarkable: honey's natural composition, rich in glucose, fructose, and trace enzymes, allowed it to preserve other ingredients, reducing spoilage in tropical climates where most rations turned rancid. Dr. Martin Kessler, the lab's lead biochemist, documented the results. The Whitmore formula exhibits extended shelf life in high-humidity environments. The enzymatic stability of honey prevents oxidation. Effectively, the product resists both mold and decay. Field ready for up to 12 months. This was a revelation. Canned meat spoiled. Bread molded. Even chocolate melted. But honey stayed stable, clean, sweet, and safe. Suddenly, what had once been mocked as Grandma's remedy became a scientific marvel. By March 1943, the Army's Emergency Nutritional Supplement Type H, derived directly from Earl's recipe, was standardized into rations for paratroopers, commandos, and reconnaissance units operating far behind enemy lines. The new bars carried a code name, Ration H. Among soldiers, it quickly earned a simpler nickname, Honey Brick. April 8, 1943, over Tunisia. At 27,000 feet, the fuselage of a C-47 transport plane rattled with turbulence. Inside, men from the 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment sat in tense silence, checking their weapons and harnesses. Sergeant James Whitmore, Earl's son, adjusted his chute straps and reached into his pocket. His fingers found a small, wax-sealed bar stamped with the Army's eagle. He smiled faintly. He knew that smell anywhere. "Hey, Sarge," called Private Reynolds, noticing. "You got one of those honey bricks?" James nodded, tearing the wrapper with his teeth. "Yeah. You ever try one?" Reynolds grinned. "We trade our cigarettes for them. Heard some farmer from Pennsylvania came up with it." James chuckled softly, chewing. "Yeah," he said. "Something like that." Moments later, the red light blinked on. The door opened to the night sky. The men stood, ready. Go! 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 They vanished into the darkness, fueled, quite literally, by the work of a man thousands of miles away. Back home, Earl received a telegram that same week. It was brief, official, and deeply personal. Your product now in standard issue airborne rations. Excellent reports from the field. Congratulations. Captain R. Langley. He folded the message carefully and pinned it above the kitchen sink, beside James's photo in uniform. Martha asked quietly, "You think he's had one?" Earl smiled. "I hope so. He helped make it, in a way." By mid-1943, production had scaled beyond imagination. Factories in Chicago, Minneapolis, and Atlanta churned out hundreds of thousands of honey bricks each month. The bars were packed into care rations, tucked into bomber survival kits, and even issued to medics as quick energy for field surgery. The press got wind of the story, but the military downplayed the details. Only a few local papers ran human interest pieces with titles like, "Farmers' Bees Feed the Boys Overseas." Earl didn't mind. He wasn't in it for fame. But there was something deeper happening. The honey brick wasn't just food, it was morale. Soldiers wrote home asking families to send honey. Mothers and wives began keeping jars in the kitchen again. Honey production tripled across the Midwest. A food once seen as a luxury became a quiet symbol of home, comfort, and endurance. And yet, as the war dragged on, Earl's small invention would soon be tested in a way he never imagined, not in sunny fields or supply labs, but in the frozen mountains of Italy, where survival itself depended on every calorie that could be carried. December 27, 1943, the Apennine Mountains, Italy. The wind screamed through the mountain passes, carrying with it a fine mist of sleet that stung exposed skin like needles. The men of the 10th Mountain Division huddled in a narrow defile, their breath steaming in the cold, their uniforms crusted with frost. Corporal Sam Delaney pulled his overcoat tighter and cursed under his breath. The supply convoy that was supposed to reach them had been ambushed 2 days earlier. Now they were down to scraps, a few tins of beans, half a sack of hardtack, and a handful of ration H bars. "Delaney," shouted Lieutenant Markson over the howling wind. "What's the count?" 13 men, 3 tins, 4 honey bricks, Delaney replied. "We can stretch it a day, maybe 2. Markson frowned. "That'll have to do." The men sat in silence, passing one of the honey bars between them, breaking it into rough chunks with their knives. The sweet, nutty smell filled the air, a tiny comfort against the cold. Private Luis Ortega, barely 19, licked the sticky residue from his fingers. "Tastes like something my mom used to make," he said softly. "Yeah," muttered Delaney. "Tastes like home." By the next morning, their situation had grown desperate. The cold gnawed at their bones, frostbite had set into 2 men's toes. The radio was dead. They were cut off, pinned between the mountains and a German patrol sweeping the valley below. When the lieutenant ordered a dawn push toward higher ground, the men moved slowly, shoulders hunched, breath ragged. But one thing surprised them: though their stomachs were empty, their strength held. Each man had eaten only 1 honey brick the day before. And somehow, it was enough. Later, in his field report, Lieutenant Markson wrote, "Morale remained unexpectedly stable despite severe caloric deficit. Honey ration sustained troop energy in freezing conditions for up to 36 hours. Soldiers referred to it as liquid fire in solid form." It wasn't just morale. The biochemical design of the honey brick, high in glucose for quick release, fructose for sustained burn, and protein from ground nuts, kept the men's blood sugar steady through the long ordeal. Where other rations failed in the cold, honey's viscosity and enzyme stability meant it never froze solid. Soldiers could chew it even at sub-zero temperatures. That simple fact saved lives. When the 10th Mountain finally reached the Allied line near Pescara 3 days later, 12 out of 13 men were still walking, frostbitten, exhausted, but alive. The medical officer noted that all of them had survived primarily on honey rations and melted snow. Word of the incident spread quickly. Field commanders requested more of the bars, calling them essential for high-altitude operations. The Quartermaster Corps quietly updated its manuals. Ration H approved for emergency field use in subarctic and mountain conditions. Back home, Earl received a letter stamped 10th Mountain Division, Italy Front. The envelope was damp and crumpled, but the handwriting inside was strong and clear. Sir, I don't know who you are, but your honey bars kept my men alive when nothing else did. We called them God's candy. I owe you more than I can say. Lieutenant R. Markson. Earl read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it next to his son's photo. He looked out the window where his hives sat buried under snowdrifts. The bees were dormant, but he smiled anyway. Good job, girls, he said softly. Spring 1944, Washington, D.C. Captain Langley stood before a panel of War Department officials, holding a folder thick with field reports. You're telling us a farmer's recipe is outperforming lab-designed rations? One of them asked skeptically. Langley nodded. Not outperforming, outlasting. The honey brick's caloric efficiency, shelf stability, and soldier acceptance rate make it ideal for long operations. It's more than food, it's morale in a wrapper. A general leaned forward. Morale doesn't win wars, Captain. Langley met his gaze evenly. No, sir. But starving men don't either. There was silence for a long moment. Then the general exhaled through his nose. Fine. Expand production. Quietly. No press releases. Just results. That day, the Quartermaster Corps authorized the Honey Energy Division, assigning several industrial food contractors to replicate and mass-produce Earl's design. Within months, production exceeded 1 million units per month. The honey brick was no longer an experiment. It was standard issue. By June 1944, small tins marked Ration H were stacked alongside ammunition crates bound for England. Each one held 6 golden bars, destined for paratroopers, medics, and pilots preparing for Operation Overlord. The day before D-Day, soldiers in the 101st Airborne unwrapped the familiar waxy rectangles, chewing slowly in the dim light of their transports. Private Tom Mendez laughed as he bit into one. Sweetest thing I'll taste all year. Another replied, don't lose your teeth before we land. It was a fleeting moment of levity, but one that mattered. The honey brick had become a ritual, a small piece of America every man could carry into the storm. When they jumped into Normandy hours later, some landed miles off target, others in flooded marshes, but they all had one thing in common: tucked into their pockets, alongside bullets and maps, were the sticky, golden rations born from a beekeeper's stubborn dream. June 7, 1944, Saint-Mire-Église, France. Amidst the chaos of gunfire and shattered buildings, a wounded medic named Paul Riley knelt beside a bleeding paratrooper. He tore open a ration tin and pulled out a honey brick, pressing it into the soldier's hand. Eat, he said. Keep your strength. Later, Riley would write in his diary. Didn't think it'd matter, but it kept him awake till we got help. Never thought honey could fight war. Guess that farmer knew something we didn't. As the war pressed on through France, Belgium, and Germany, the honey brick became more than sustenance. It became a symbol. A quiet reminder of what America was fighting for, not just survival, but ingenuity, resilience, and the belief that even the smallest, simplest ideas could make a difference. And for Earl Whitmore, the man who once drove away from the depot humiliated, that stupid trick had become something far greater than he ever intended. But he still didn't know, not yet, that his invention had reached the highest levels of command. That even generals, stranded during surprise attacks, had relied on the same honey that once came from his fields in Pennsylvania. The farmer's idea was about to reach its most unlikely destination of all. December 23, 1944, near Bastogne, Belgium. Snow blanketed the Ardennes in thick silence, broken only by distant artillery. The Battle of the Bulge was at its peak, a frozen hellscape of smoke, mud, and desperation. American forces were surrounded, low on fuel, food, and morale. In a dim cellar beneath a half-ruined farmhouse, General Anthony McAuliffe, commander of the 101st Airborne Division, sat at a makeshift table with a small lantern flickering beside him. His men were exhausted. Supplies were gone. Temperatures had dropped below freezing. McAuliffe reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, dented tin, one of the few left from a supply drop the week before. Inside were 3 ration H honey bricks. He broke one in half and handed it to his aide, Colonel Harper. "Merry Christmas," McAuliffe said with a weary grin. Harper smirked. "Tastes better than the Kraut's surrender demand." They both laughed quietly, that short, incredulous laughter of men holding the line against the impossible. Outside, mortars echoed across the valley. McAuliffe chewed slowly, savoring the dense, sweet bar. It stuck to his teeth, clinging to the last vestiges of warmth in his body. And in that moment, the general of a besieged division, cut off, freezing, and hungry, was kept alive, in part, by the stupid trick of a farmer he would never meet. January 1945, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The war was turning, but the winter had been brutal. Earl stood in his workshop, mending a cracked honey extractor when the postman trudged up through the snow, waving a telegram. "From Europe," the man said, breath puffing in the cold. Earl took it, hands trembling. The message read: "Your product credited in maintaining troop strength during Ardennes counteroffensive. Quartermaster Corps extends commendation for contribution to national defense. A. McAuliffe, Brig Gen., 101st Airborne." For a long time, Earl said nothing. He just stared at the words until the ink blurred. Then he looked up at his hives, still blanketed in white, and whispered, "We did it, girls." Spring 1945, Washington, D.C. Captain Robert Langley stood in front of a War Department review board for what would be his final wartime presentation. On the table before him lay a tin of ration H, unopened, pristine, and simple. "This," he said, holding it up, started on a small farm in Lancaster. It fed paratroopers, mountain divisions, bomber crews, and rescue teams. It survived heat, cold, and chaos. And through it all, it reminded our men of home. Civilians began making their own versions of the honey brick, for hikers, rescue workers, and explorers. The idea spread worldwide. In 1953, a small company in New York licensed his recipe for commercial production under the name Victory Bar. Even decades later, the formula, honey, oats, nuts, powdered milk, remained the basis for modern energy bars used by soldiers, athletes, and astronauts alike. Earl never sought fame. When reporters came to his farm, he gave short answers, often returning to his hives mid-interview. It wasn't a miracle, he'd say. Just nature lending a hand. But in quiet moments, he'd look at the framed telegram from General McAuliffe and the letter from the 10th Mountain Division, and he'd smile. He had done his part. Epilogue, Arlington National Cemetery, 1967. A crisp autumn wind swept through the rows of white headstones. A small group of soldiers, veterans now, their hair gray and their medals gleaming faintly, gathered for the burial of Earl Whitmore, aged 72. Among them stood retired Colonel Robert Langley and Lieutenant Markson from the 10th Mountain. Each placed a small tin of ration H on the casket before it was lowered into the earth. Markson murmured, "He kept us alive." Langley nodded. "And he kept us believing." Above them, the sunlight filtered through the trees, glinting gold, like honey caught in glass. And as the bugler played taps, it seemed, for just a moment, that the faint hum of bees echoed in the wind, carrying on the legacy of the farmer whose stupid trick had once fed an army and helped win a war.